Hi, my name is Philip Ballentine, and I'm really excited to give this presentation today about some exciting work that we've been doing recently at Atropos Health using generative AI on a pretty interesting problem that we encounter quite a bit: medication text string to RxNorm conversion. So before I introduce the problem, I just want to talk really quickly a tiny bit about Atropos Health. Atropos Health is a company that's devoted to closing evidence gaps. We work with health systems and life sciences companies. We work to improve individual patient outcomes and expedite research that advances the field of medicine with timely, relevant real world evidence and real world data. And I lead the data engineering team at Atropos Health. This problem that I have up on the screen here is a pretty common problem that's faced with RWD and RWE, which is essentially that often when we are working with EHR data sets, there's not enough normalization of medication text strings to a terminology. This problem is actually not unique to medications, but medications are a very important aspect of RWD and RWE when working with life sciences customers. So this is the issue that we chose to focus on. We have this large EHR data set with over 160 million patient records and nearly 5 billion medication records. And it has a very low rate of mapping to standard terminology, which made it really difficult to use for certain of our use cases. With the last year and everything that's been going on with generative AI, and as the data engineering team has grown in Atropos, we wanted to tackle this problem and do an evaluation of a couple of different approaches to normalizing this data. Essentially, we were looking at both possibly just having a medication expert do the mapping by hand. But we also wanted to look at a number of other approaches and do a really rigorous evaluation of the success of those approaches. And I also have linked our full white paper that we wrote about this. To dive further into the problem, an example of a medication text string that's not normalized is up on the screen here. There were about 95,000 of these in the data. And the problem really comes from the fact that when you just have medication text strings, it's very hard to search through. You have to use a lot of fuzzy matching. You can get false positive matches. It just adds a lot of cognitive burden to analysts trying to curate value sets with thousands of these text strings. And also, these text strings don't connect to any known knowledge graphs. So for example, if this was already mapped to RxNorm, you could very easily pull a list of everything with a certain medication ingredient, or everything with a certain medication ingredient with a certain type of delivery. Whereas with the text string, you have to do everything based off of fuzzy text searching. And again, the scale of this problem with this data set was very, very large. So there were over 3 billion records that had totally unmapped text strings and 95,000 unique terms that we'd have to sit down and try to map by hand. Luckily, like many HR data sets, there's sort of a very skewed distribution of the frequency of terms. So you can see the CDF here. It meant that we could choose the 1,000 most common terms from the data, and it would actually constitute a majority of those 3 billion records. So we focused on the 1,000 most common terms for this evaluation. However, I should say it's not really enough to just do 1,000 terms. We actually would need to scale that out considerably more for production. I get into the results of doing that at the end of the presentation. Essentially, we came up with an approach and we evaluated a number of approaches, but the one that we ended up going with, the one that performed the best, we termed generative terminology mapping. And it involved first using a pretty standard existing mapping solution, which is the publicly available UMLS API. We bounced terms against that. And then in order to filter out the very small minority of terms that were incorrect that we got back, we actually took that proposed map from the UMLS API and bounced it against an LLM. In this case, we used GPT-4 by OpenAI. And all we asked that second step, that LLM step, to do was evaluate the correctness of the map. So the goal here was just to discard maps from the first step that were not correct. And I go into a little bit of why we chose this approach, but very simply, that is the approach that we took, a combination of a more traditional approach and then also this new generative technology that became available. And then finally, just to go through what we do here, we go through the first step, we do the second step. We then, if the LLM approves the map, we would accept it. And if the LLM flagged it as being incorrect, we would reject it and then send it back for human evaluation. Or at the very least, we just wouldn't let it go into the final data. Here's an example of the prompt that we used for that second step, where we told GPT-4 that it was a expert medication term mapper and asked it some very specific questions about different types of we chose to focus on ingredient correctness as defined here, which is that the source term and the map term share 100% of the same ingredients, and the map term does not omit any ingredients or introduce any ingredients that aren't mentioned in the source term. The reason why we chose this was that often when dealing with the questions that we get from our customers, it's pretty sufficient a lot of the time to be correct at the ingredient level and not have to match the exact strength or form of the medication. So, as a caveat to this whole exercise, this approach really is oriented towards that ingredient correctness. And although it performs, it is not a panacea for all of the other types of correctness that you could wish for in a mapping of a source term to RxNorm. Here's an example of the response, although we get the response in JSON form, but this is parsed out a little bit. And here's an example of the verdict that we get from GPT-4, as well as some reasoning. We chose this approach ultimately because although the UMLS API alone had a pretty high level of ingredient correctness, 92.5%, that is not sufficient for our use cases. It was not really sufficient for us to still be wrong at the ingredient level 7.5% of the time. So that's why we accepted the first map, but only insofar as we would then send it through the second phase of the process, where we asked ChatGPT, GPT-4 to pull out the incorrect mappings. It's important also to note that on this slide, the final maps are those that would be propagated into the data. So you can see that this approach would result, out of roughly 1,000 that we put in, 923 would make it into the data. We've wanted to really thoroughly validate this approach, so we engaged an expert informaticist and actually had them evaluate the results of using this on the top 1,000 most frequent terms. And you can see here the results. So there were 7 false positives and 7 false negatives that resulted here. And otherwise, there was complete agreement between our human expert and this process, which I was very surprised that the level of agreement was this high. I was certainly expecting a fairly high level of agreement, but this was very, very high relative to my expectation. So again, we got 99.2% accuracy at roughly 2% of the cost that we estimate from having a person do 100% of these maps. And I'll go into some details more about the results here, but we also found that in the cases of the errors that would actually be significant, which would be a mapping that was incorrect actually being deemed by GPT-4 as being correct and then being sent into the data. Number one, there was very few of them, and number two, actually, when you look closer at what those were, the the sort of significance of those errors was pretty low in most cases. So we can show you exactly what we mean here. But essentially, the approach here demonstrates that the capabilities of GPT-4 to kind of replicate a tiny piece of human reasoning here were quite high, and the errors were not completely seemingly random or completely out of bounds. That it was sort of pretty close, even though we ultimately deemed that there were these 0.7% of the time there was an error being made. And finally, it's interesting, I think, that we were able to do this using a completely non-healthcare specific generative AI model, although obviously a very advanced one. But we did no fine tuning, no exposing our data to the model previously before this. It was not a specialty healthcare model of any kind. This was just completely off the shelf. Just here's an example of the cost breakdown that we kind of estimate. This is how we arrived at the 2.5 cents per map cost, which includes both the cost of the tokens going in and out, but then also the cost of the compute to run this mapping pipeline. Here's an example of terms that the human and GPT-4 indicated that it was ingredient incorrect. And ingredient correct. So I want to focus quickly here on the false positive errors, which really are the problematic errors, right, that we would be very concerned about, which would be an error, a mapping that was actually in reality incorrect, being deemed correct, and then going into the data. So on the next slide, I will be able to show you all 7 of these. These were the only ones of these errors that came from the 1,000 terms that we evaluated. So here you can see that a few of them are, and again, I'm not a clinical expert, I'm a data engineer, so I don't want to dive too deep here, but you can see that the terms are relatively close to one another, even though ultimately our human expert deemed these to not be ingredient correct. And the reasons for that have to do with some relative nuance here between different salts and issues with the model making inferences that our human expert disagreed with. So based on the success of the 1,000 terms that we initially sent through this process and, sort of our creation of this approach, we actually did apply this to the full data in early 2024. So by this point, due to some changes in the underlying data set, there were actually more than 200,000 distinct source medication terms. And we did a sort of alpha run of this mapping pipeline, and we were able to increase the overall percentage of records that we could map to RxNorm from 32.9% to 87.8%. And we sent about 140,000 terms through the UMLS API, and of these, 117,000 through the OpenAI step of the mapping, focusing on the most common terms. But we sent, about half of all terms were sent through just in our first run here. The reason why we didn't do all of them really had more to do with just timing, as well as wanting to do a sort of alpha run and then again step back and assess, because we were a little concerned that although it performed very well on the 1,000 most common terms, when we really scaled out to the long tail of the distribution of rarer medication terms, we were concerned that the performance would drop. So we did about 100,000 of these, and the total cost was about $2,300. And after this, we did another random sample of all of the terms that we had mapped and found actually zero false positive errors. So zero errors where a map that was ingredient incorrect would have made it into our data. So, which implies since it was a random sample, we just calculate the confidence, the 95% confidence interval, and essentially we're able to conclude that it didn't seem like the performance was declining or drastically different, even though we were now mapping terms that were far more rare in the data than the first most common 1,000 terms. So thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this approach. And we, again, published a white paper that really goes into a lot more detail about our evaluation. And all of these components are completely available to everyone. So the MLS API is freely open and usable. Although it is a proprietary model, there is nothing stopping folks from signing up for OpenAI and using GPT-4. And we think that this is a good way of trying to get the word out there that this approach is possible. And I'm sure that other people would be able to get even better results with additional steps to do validation or additional fine tuning or more advanced models or better prompts. We really just want to share this work, and hopefully many people are facing the problem of this unmapped medication text strings in data sets that they want to analyze. And we hope that this will be a contribution to clearing up that problem as we move forward and begin to take more advantage of generative AI, which is very exciting. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering questions as I can.